So thank you, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here at this kind of historic gathering. While they're setting up, just a few things. So today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of collective intelligence, one of the ways that we may achieve superhuman intelligence. And one of the big questions I think about a lot is really, what is the self? I've thought about that from many perspectives for many years. What is the self? Is it something artificial? Is it an illusion? Is it something we can synthesize? If we can synthesize it, how large could it be? Could it exist on other substrates? So just hold that in your mind, and we're going to jump into a very rapid-fire, compressed presentation of an hour down to 18 minutes, but with lots of slides. But you're all really smart, so it should be no problem. So quickly a pause. Okay, the pause is over. Thank you. We're going to talk about an idea that preceded the singularity. It was the sort of singularity of the previous century, and that is this notion of the global brain. It's a big meme. It's been evolving for a long time. And I just want to acknowledge some of the amazing thinkers who came before all of us, who've been thinking about this for a really long time. We're going to quickly review some of them. So let's talk briefly. Herbert Spencer, he thought a lot about the evolution of society, social Darwinism, but he actually coined the term survival of the fittest and thought about the long-term evolution of complexity. H.G. Wells, we're all familiar with him. He wrote a wonderful book about the world brain and talked about this notion of an encyclopedia, kind of global encyclopedia, and the role of encyclopedias in really catalyzing civilization. He thought of encyclopedias as a kind of central ganglion of society, enabling societies to become more intelligent. So he was really one of the big thinkers who originated this concept of a global brain. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French Jesuit priest, philosopher, paleontologist, among other things, he originated this idea of the omega point and the noosphere. The omega point is basically this future massive singularity beyond even the computer singularity. This is a kind of universal singularity where the whole universe essentially wakes up and becomes conscious. And he basically felt that this already exists off in the future, and it's the prime cause. It's a very Jesuit idea, this prime mover that's pulling us essentially towards it. Joel de Rosnay, a French futurist from MIT actually, he was one of the first people to talk about the relationship of the internet to the global brain and thought of humans as neurons in a cybernetic superorganism. Moving on to some more recent thinkers, Valentin Turchin, the notion of a metasystem transition. It's a very important idea, this notion that you can create systems out of parts which themselves are the same essentially as a system. So superorganisms, for example, are composed of organisms. You can create an intelligence that's made of intelligences. And so he was thinking about this transitions from systems to metasystems that are made of those same systems. Peter Russell wrote a book on the global brain, and he took a more of a New Age perspective to it, thinking more about the spiritual aspects, the Gaia hypothesis, the notion of kind of the collective unconscious, the collective consciousness that already is there, and how that is sort of starting to unfold, essentially the age of Aquarius, but also a lot of interesting ideas there, and it was actually a big selling book and catalyzed a lot of thinking. Gottfried Meyer-Kress wrote about human and computer agents in the global brain. Gregory Stock wrote a wonderful book called Metaman about the human superorganism and how humans and machines are entering together into a form of symbiosis, and that our society today is already essentially a superorganism. And another person, Brian Gaines, wrote about similar concepts. One very important thinker is Francis Halen out of Belgium, and he runs a project called the Principia Cybernetica. That's one of the most useful, interesting sites on this subject, and I encourage everybody to check it out. They studied superorganisms, they've studied a lot of things related to collective intelligence, and they've had debates about whether humanity is or is not a superorganism. But one of the more interesting results of some of their work was some implementation thinking about spreading activation on the net and how to actually create learning networks where essentially Hebbian learning would start to emerge on the web. And it's very interesting stuff I encourage you to read about. Our own Ben Goertzel here has written extensively and even started ventures to try to do some of this around the worldwide brain and massive forms of distributed intelligence, and he's still working on these things. You can probably speak to him and he'll explain his ideas better than I could. We have other people talking about sort of Miller's living systems. There are 19 subsystems that all living systems have, and the internet apparently, according to these researchers, qualifies as a living system. And then Howard Bloom, my friend Howard Bloom, thinks that the global brain has actually been evolving for billions of years, if not longer. Essentially, he believes that it starts with physics, and that the universe itself, at a very basic level, is evolving intelligence. Other researchers, like Parker Russman, have talked about how to tackle world problems using the global brain and collective intelligence. John Stewart feels that evolution favors organizations of higher and higher complexity. And so there's something in evolution itself which is driving the creation of higher order intelligence. Robert Wright feels the same way, that biology leads to vaster forms of social complexity. Michael Brooks focused on the big brother aspects of the global mind. Is it going to be some evil system where everything is under control and nobody has any individuality or privacy? But borrowing from a friend, somebody you all know, this person, Kevin Kelly, let's talk about a story. So this is the story of one. It's reliable. It's efficient. It doubles in power every 2 years. And it runs on one network. It's never interrupted. It's global. It's one machine. And it already consumes 5% of the world's electricity. So what is it? Obviously, you all know the answer. The internet, the one machine. So the latest incarnation of the global mind meme is really the web, and people who are thinking about the internet and the web as becoming some sort of self-aware, super intelligent system. And we can talk about statistics. We don't have too much time to go into it, but the internet is already vastly more powerful collectively than an individual human brain. And we've seen Kurzweil's chart, for example, charting the growth of intelligence, and it looks like, if Moore's law holds up, that in the not too distant future, the computing power equivalent to all human brains will cost about $1,000, and that's kind of interesting. So the question is, if this all happens, will the global brain have its own mind? So we can quickly talk about the evolution of the global mind. Now, the mind is kind of the software and maybe the self or the consciousness of this system. If we kind of go back, we can trace it back to spoken languages, to writing systems, to forms of communication, from paper mail to telegraphs and telephones and radio, all the way up through fax machines, the internet, and so forth, and to groupware, starting to create forms of collective intelligence. Of course, we had collective intelligence in monasteries and early universities and libraries. Just wasn't as efficient. Today, it's much more efficient. And as we move out into the future, past Web 2.0, where we still are, into the third decade, Web 3.0, we have the semantic web, which is, as Werner Vinge said, it's a way of outsourcing or outboarding more and more of our intellect, making it explicit and machine understandable. Moving beyond that, the sort of intelligent web, the web OS, and the emergence of what I call group minds, which are pockets of very intelligent collective intelligence, more intelligent than your typical group. And then beyond that, what Werner Vinge talks about, and when he talks about ultra-intelligent machines and superhuman intelligence, I do believe that will happen, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And finally, this notion of the global self and what that is and its ability to reproduce. So we'll talk about Web 4.0 a little bit and the emergence of global intelligence. So there are kind of three big points here. First, there is this phase of evolving intelligence, and in particular, Kurzweil and others have really thought a lot about this, the evolution of highly intelligent software and super intelligent machines. And so we talk about this notion of superhuman intelligence. I'm going to talk a little bit about meta-level intelligence as well. Superhuman intelligence is not just intelligent software, but it could happen in many ways. It could be large collectives, large ensembles that become superhumanly intelligent. And then meta-level intelligence is something else. It's a final stage where these systems evolve a higher form of intelligence, and we'll talk about that, where they have a sense of self-awareness. So let's talk about the evolution of intelligence. Kurzweil makes a very good case for this happening. The only question I would ask is when. I think it will happen. It's just a question of when. Now, it depends really on what level intelligent computation is taking place in the brain. It may be happening at the level we think, or as some people are starting to think, it may happen at a quantum level, which is many orders of magnitude smaller, if that's the case, it might take us a bit longer to reach that point, and we don't really know yet. One question I've been thinking a lot about is really how connected is human intelligence to the substrate? Are we actually space-time machines? If that's the case, are the computers and the software systems that we're creating really mirroring that structure? It may actually be that to make a system that's truly intelligent, it actually has to interact directly with the substrate. And so maybe we have to get into quantum computation to really do that. And what we have today may sort of mirrors or imitations, but they don't really touch the substrate in a direct way. So that's something interesting to think about. But in any case, the rate of growth is increasing. According to Kurzweil, within about 20 years, we should have simulations of all sections of the brain. That's quite interesting. 2030s, one brain is about $1, so that's nice. We can have a bunch of brains in our pocket. And by the 2040s, machine intelligence will be at least 1 billion times greater than human intelligence. And then eventually in the long-term future, according to Kurzweil, and I totally agree, intelligence will spread throughout the universe. Now, maybe it's hubris for us to think that it's starting here. Maybe it started somewhere else, and we are just the result of that. But in any case, I do think that the cosmos is a big intelligence-spreading system, and we are a sort of bacterial colony within that. So let's talk a little bit about where this heads. Human-machine symbiosis is an important topic. This is a friend of mine made this picture. It's a full-body sensor suit. And the basic notion is with augmented reality, we may not need to go into a virtual reality. The virtual reality is coming into our reality. It may actually be that this physical world that we live in will actually become so augmented that the distinction between the actual and the virtual will just go away. We won't necessarily be living in a second life kind of environment. Instead, it'll be first life. But first life will be so augmented that it'll be like a virtual reality. So in this case, we may wear suits like this, or these things may become so small or so embedded that they won't actually appear or be visible, but it seems to be the direction we're headed. And this kind of brings up this notion of superorganisms in general. So there are many kinds of superorganisms, and the question is humanity and its machines some form of superorganism in the early stages of evolution? An interesting thing about superorganisms is that in general, the individuals within them don't really act as the units of reproduction, but rather it's the colony as a whole that reproduces. Now, in the case of humanity, we can't really say that yet. I mean, we individuals can reproduce, although it's kind of interesting that birth rates are going down, sperm counts are going down, fertility is going down. I don't know if that means anything, but it's an interesting trend. Are we sort of headed towards a true superorganism where maybe we end up with a kind of caste-like system? Most superorganisms have this very caste-like structure where there are different roles, even physically different kinds of organisms. Maybe there will be people in the future who are sort of specifically evolved for science and technology, and other people who are specifically evolved for being soldiers, and other people are specifically evolved for art. Who knows? As we specialize, as the forces of natural selection become less about the environment and more about the intellect, a lot of strange things may happen. We don't really know how the body and mind will change. So moving into superhuman intelligence, we're all familiar with this picture, the Borg. Werner Vinge has talked a lot about the evolution of superhuman intelligence, and he's actually talked about several different routes that may come about. One of the interesting things he also talks about are ultra-intelligent machines. Ultra-intelligent machines are machines that are so much smarter than humans that we can't imagine what they can do. And interestingly, I like the way he puts this, they're the last invention that we'll ever make. Once an ultra-intelligent machine is created, it will start inventing things. We won't need to make anything anymore, and in fact, we won't be able to keep up. So, is this avoidable? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it inevitable? Well, there are 4 ways that it might unfold. One is that computers themselves become awake and superhumanly intelligent. This is kind of the Kurzweil approach. The other approach is that large computer networks themselves wake up. This is the sort of Terminator view, Skynet suddenly waking up because of magical complexity or some other route to becoming self-aware. Another approach is that the interface becomes so intimate, that we become so connected to our computers and to each other that effectively each individual becomes superhuman without really the network being superhuman or software becoming superhuman, but the whole system essentially is superhuman, but it's focused around the individual. And finally, there's the human intellect can also be enhanced through biological means and others to become superhuman. So that's just the organism approach. So moving forward, this third layer that I'm thinking about beyond all of this is meta-level intelligence. And this is something I want to talk about specifically. Is there a way to make a group or a collective have a sense of self, to have a sense of its own identity beyond what we're doing today? Now, when we think about it, the brain, the human brain, is this vast distributed system, hundreds of billions of parts. There's not necessarily any self or consciousness in any of the parts. Somehow it's there emerging on that network. If we believe that can happen, if it's happening now, why can't that happen on a larger network? Why couldn't a larger network that in some way is functionally similar also then have a kind of consciousness and self? There's no physical reason that we know of yet to say that we can't do that, and there's also no philosophical reason why it couldn't happen. So the question will really be, how connected is the substrate to all of this? How connected do these systems have to be to space and time directly, to the physical laws directly? We don't know yet. But it's a very important idea here, because organizations today are really stupid. And they're also the kind of prime movers in the world today. You know, individual humans are important, but organizations are really the forces of change in the world today. And they're just not very smart. So we actually have to make them smarter. And if we make them smarter, actually the world will be a better place. To do that, they've got to form a kind of higher order intelligence. Today, they're kind of like amoebas at best. And we need to enable them to become smarter. So there are different levels of kind of collective intelligence I want to talk about. There are crowds, that's kind of level one. And in a crowd, you've got a lot of individuals who are not really aware that they're part of something. They don't identify with each other, and they're all acting independently. And yet, a crowd can exhibit a kind of intelligence, for example, a school of fish, flocking behavior. These are crowd behaviors which collectively are intelligent, but individually, there's no sense of the whole. Level two, these are groups. In a group, there is some sort of structure, some form of leadership, some shared identity and goal. And so many of the corporations and other forms of larger organizations that we deal with today are groups, they're not really crowds. On the web, we've got crowds. Interesting that crowds are starting to outpace groups in some cases, but there's still something about groups that makes them much better at goal-directed behavior. Groups are able to plan, to work on things, and to achieve longer-term goals than crowds. Finally, level three, I think of these as selves. These are actually entities. These are agents with a kind of mental fusion. Groups sometimes, but rarely, achieve that. Some organizations are able to create that, but only within a small subset of the organization. Very rarely do we see even small groups achieving this. But when it happens, you get an amazing kind of emergent intelligence where the group as a whole functions far more productively than the lower forms of collective intelligence. So the question is, how do we make this possible? How do we create these meta-selves? Meta-selves are the key to making these entities which are kind of higher order forms of intelligence. When we think of our own minds, we have this illusory self. Now, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist. I've studied this intensively from both the scientific perspective and the spiritual perspective. And the interesting thing is there's agreement. The Buddhist view is that the self is an illusion. It's a construct. And actually, many people now working in neuroscience and in cognitive science would agree it's a construct. That's good news. If it wasn't a construct, we'd be in trouble. The fact that it's a construct means that we can make these things for machines, for groups, for organizations. We can actually make functionally equivalent systems which function like selves for larger groups. Now, the self is important because it doesn't necessarily control, it mirrors, it actually represents. But simply having a mirror enables everybody in the group to adjust their behavior. It's like a catalyst. So there are different approaches to creating collective intelligence. One is top-down, another is bottom-up. And by adding a self, it's actually more of a bottom-up approach. You're creating a mirror, and then the group is organizing itself by seeing its own reflection. So basically, meta-selves are this higher conceptual construct that mirror. They also can be reasoners and actors. Think about Amazon Mechanical Turk as just a very rudimentary example, the ability to program the collective behavior of a large group of people. Imagine if you had a system that mirrored a group, your group, for example, that said, here's our current environment, here's our internal and external state, here's who we think we are and how we think we're doing. Also, here are the goals that we've agreed on and our progress towards those goals. Here are things that need to happen or need not to happen in order to further those goals. Suddenly, there's a kind of planning and coordinating, reasoning function. Imagine if it could also watch and learn as the group worked to help the group be more productive in the future. I worked on a project, a DARPA project through SRI called KALO, which did precisely that. It was very interesting, learning from large groups as they worked, and then starting to facilitate individual and collective behavior. So there are kind of 7 functions that I think are important to meta-selves. They have to have a way to consolidate sensory input. So they've got to be able to bring a lot of data in, aggregate that input, and turn it into a map or a self-representation of internal and external state. There's a kind of identity, and identity doesn't just mean I, it also means other. You've got to have self and other represented in this system. They also have to have the ability to introspect, and the introspection can happen both on a human level and on a machine level. So whether it's humans introspecting about the state of the system or their own role, or machines introspecting, they have to work together. They have to be able to explore. They have to be able to have learning and memory, thinking and creativity. Now I'm a little over time, so I'm going to rush through the rest of this. They have to be able to orchestrate their output. And if you can make systems that can do this, and I believe we can, then you will catalyze a higher order of collective intelligence beyond what we have today. Will they be sentient beings? That's the interesting question. And basically, there's 2 approaches to this. It comes down to consciousness, in my opinion. And either it's an illusion, or it's not an illusion. Either way, however, because humans are already conscious, whatever that is, and they're part of these systems, we can say that the systems are conscious. And therefore, essentially, the web is going to wake up. It's just a question of whether it will wake up in a higher order or on a first order. But it is going to wake up because we are already awake and we are part of it. So will this be a cataclysm? Will it be a golden age? Well, we'll have to wait and see. These 3 principles are something to think about, this evolution to higher intelligence. And I'll just leave with a quote, which is from Freeman Dyson, which is, "God is what mind becomes when it is passed beyond the scale of our comprehension." And thanks to Werner Vinci for finding that quote for me. I think we should think about that. The notion of God and the horizon of God is going to actually get farther and farther away as we develop. So today, God seems like this thing that runs the universe, if you believe in God, or it doesn't exist at all. In the future, as we become more godlike, it'll be interesting how our conception will change as well. So thank you very much.